Good morning. Good morning. I'm Roberto Barragan. I'm the Executive Director of the California Community Economic Development Association. We're an association of some 200 community development corporations, community action agencies, and community development financial institutions across the state of California who are focused on community revitalization in underserved communities. Over the past couple of years, as the housing crisis, and in some cases homeless crisis, has deepened across California, more and more organizations who serve community action agencies in Bakersfield, nonprofit organizations in Santa Cruz, have come to us asking, how as an organization, of size or not of size, how do we begin looking at how do we take part in and become part of the solution to the lack of housing, the lack of affordable housing, and the increasing homeless situations in our communities. And so we've asked SCAMP, Alan Greenfield and SCAMP, to work together to put together this affordable housing one-on-one opportunity to organizations that want to learn more about how affordable housing development, and potentially in communities where there's a dearth of affordable housing developers, begin to see how can they themselves be part of the solution. So I want to thank Callie, I want to thank SCAMP, I want to thank Alan for bringing this incredible group of people together to talk to you about affordable housing and give you some of the basics, the one-on-one of it, hoping that you're going to be able to take this information and make some inroads on the crisis across California. Thank you very much, Alan, and let me finish over to Alan Greenleaf.
Thanks, Roberto. Appreciate it. We're so happy to be working on this with you guys, and looking forward to today's session. I was just in contact with folks in our office. It looks like we had 247 people register for this event, and so I think it's an indication of not only the affordable housing crisis and the homelessness crisis that we're experiencing, but the interest in people trying to get to solutions. So we look forward to spending the next couple of hours with you. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining today. I'm Alan Greenlee. I'm the Executive Director, as Roberto said, of the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing, affectionately known as SCAMP. We're a member association of organizations and individuals dedicated to the development and operation of homes that are affordable to low-income people in our community. We serve as a collective voice of affordable housing and the affordable housing industry in political and policy contexts. And we offer capacity building and educational programming such as this to our industry and other interested parties. No other organization in Southern California directly addresses the capacity building of both affordable housing professionals and the public sector with a similar breadth and content. For example, last year we did 35 events such as these that served over 4,000 attendees. Among our regular programs is today's session. We launched the California Affordable Housing Leadership Institute, known as CALI, in 2018 to provide affordable housing and financing 101 training to primary staff of elected officials and those in the public sector. And so we've done this at least annually since then, and sometimes more than that. CALI trainings have been effective. They've been an effective way to support a favorable housing ecosystem and foster greater industry connections. And importantly, it is taught by SCAMP members who offer firsthand insights as practitioners. So we're going to get started. I just want to handle one piece of housekeeping, and that is members of the audience are certainly welcome to ask questions along the way. In fact, we encourage them. And we'd ask for you to utilize the Q&A box on your screen as the place where you can share questions. And then we're going to get started. Today we've got three speakers. And the first one is, well, we have three speakers. Let me introduce those. Yasmin Tong, the founding principal at CTY Housing, CTY Housing. Secondly, Laura Regas is a SCAMP board member and the Senior Vice President of Real Estate Development at Abode Communities. And lastly, Bill Paveo. He's the former Executive Director of the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee and also a former SCAMP board member. And with that, I think we're going to start off with Yasmin. Bill and Laura and Roberto and Elias, y'all are all welcome to stay on video if you'd like, but you're also welcome to turn off your camera. And Yasmin, you have the floor.
Thanks, Alan. It's good to see you. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for attending this workshop on affordable housing financing. We can go to the next slide. I was asked to talk about, let's see, we've got an agenda. So I will be talking about number 2, the nuts and bolts, the initial steps on assessment and development. And so I think where I wanted to start was really what's your vision? You know, if you have control over a piece of land and you want to turn it into affordable housing, then you want to ask yourself questions like, who do we want to house, and how many apartments do we want to have here, and what other kinds of amenities do we want to have on this site? And I think since it sounds like most of you are from public agencies, the other question is like, what are your local priorities? I mean, maybe you want to focus on seniors, or you want to focus on homeless housing, or housing for other special needs groups. And then I think as a property owner, you need to ask yourself, what do you need to control? And I think if you're working with affordable housing developers, be they for-profit or nonprofit, are you going to be part of the development entity, part of the ownership? Are you going to be a landowner and control things through a ground lease? I mean, there are just a plethora of different ways that you can be involved in the development, and you need to have some, I think it's the more you can kind of figure out what you want out of this process, and then the better off you're going to be in terms of actually achieving those goals. And then, what are your expectations for the developer or your joint venture partner? How do you want them to communicate with you? How often do you need to meet with them? Do you need to be involved in the decision making? What decisions do you need to be part of? So all those are the kinds of things that I think you want to be asking yourselves before you, take your first step into identifying a development partner, or identifying a consultant to help you negotiate with a development partner. We can go to the next slide. So I think part of the I'm going to give a couple of examples to talk about the importance of due diligence. And this is really trying to understand what your site can allow, and also who has authority over that piece of property. So a while ago, I was asked to help a church that had a parking lot, and they were interested in seeing that parking lot turn into affordable housing. And they found a partner to work with. I think they had maybe like a memorandum of understanding between them, and basically the church was going through this process of they'd set up a committee. They were trying to decide whether or not they wanted to proceed with, like entering into this joint venture with the nonprofit affordable housing developer. And it took, a long time to answer all the questions and sort of get to the point where they were saying, okay, we're ready to go. They, passed a board resolution. And then one way or another, they started asking more questions and talking to other people within the church hierarchy. And they realized, like, oh, we really don't have the authority to do anything over this. So, they had used up a lot of time and energy, and basically, to get to this point where they were ready to proceed, and they weren't authorized to proceed. And so I think it's really important to, understand who owns the site, I mean, it seems really basic, but who owns the site and what legal authority do you need to, like, extend site control to somebody else over the site? So that's a really important thing to kind of figure out early on. And then, then you're also going to be kind of creating a vision. And so what's going to inform that vision is the zoning. And so I think you could have a consultant do this, but you could also do it yourselves. You can ask the planning department a couple of questions. You can go to them with your property address and say, what can I develop on my site? I'm interested in putting apartments here. How many can I put? How many parking spaces do I need? And what's the approval process for me to develop, to create a development that meets these conditions? And it's amazing what kinds of, like, I was working with another church recently, and they had they'd actually had a very expensive feasibility study completed on their behalf, and there were all kinds of beautiful designs and a lot of information in this report, but it turned out that it didn't acknowledge that the property was also a historic, I mean, it was listed as a potentially historic site, which, is an important thing to know about up front. So, so I think, it's important to kind of understand what are kind of what are the underlying conditions of the site that you're interested in developing. And similarly, you can do some of that investigation through a title report. There might be restrictions recorded on the property, especially for publicly owned sites. There might be surface mineral rights that could cause issues as well. So, you need to kind of work out some of those. You need to answer some of these questions, and then you can say, all right, well, now we know we could build 50 apartments here, and we would need so many parking spaces, and we've decided what our target population is going to be. Now let's talk to the elected officials who whose district this property is in, and talk to them about our vision and get their input about what we're interested in doing. And maybe they have some different thoughts about the population who should be at the site, or there should be more parking spaces, or if you move ahead with this, then make sure you add this, and this, or make sure you talk to these and these people. So due diligence, really, really, really important. And I know other folks are going to talk more about that, but that's also part of this initial assessment that you'll want to pursue. So we can go to the next slide. So then I think another really important part of this is selecting the right team. I feel a little uncomfortable. I feel like I have a little bit of a conflict of interest saying, you need a consultant, but in certain situations, you do need a consultant to help you with selecting a team. And sometimes you don't need a consultant, and you just need to work on finding the right team members to help you put the transaction together. But I think the process is the same, regardless of whether you need a consultant to help you navigate the process, or whether you're public agency and you want to do an RFP. I mean, you want to establish selection criteria, and I think a big part of that is what's the applicant's prior experience doing what I want them to do. Sometimes you don't need just someone who's developed affordable housing. What you need is someone who's developed a specific kind of affordable housing, or who's, for example, worked with church groups to help them, develop underutilized land, or, anyway, I mean, there are just a number of examples, but you want someone who's got experience doing what you want them to do. And then there's, preparing a request for proposals. So with that, you are trying to reflect what your priorities are, what you want to see the development become. So getting back to that target population, how, like, a schedule of performance. You don't want to pick a team or pick a developer and they take 4 years to to finish the due diligence. You want them to perform as quickly as possible. So you'll want to establish milestones, by when it's, you want them to do certain things. And you want those milestones to be realistic and also acknowledge that sometimes, things come up along the way that might make you have to extend your schedule as well. Um, so that's another issue, is just, the timing of performance. And then you'll also want to have, clearly defined deliverables for your proposers. So, you'll want to maybe see their financial statements, or you'll want to see their um, resumes or past projects or what have you. So all of that is going to go into your request for proposals. And then you'll want to have like a short list of entities that are invited potentially, but if you're a public agency, you don't necessarily have the opportunity to narrow it down. You have to sort of invite everybody to participate, so you have a fair bidding process. You can go to the next slide. And then once you receive and vet those proposals, then you'll have, again, like another shorter list to help you of sort of like your finalists. And so then you'll want to conduct interviews, to ask your applicants to explain aspects of their proposal or anything that you had questions about in your review of what they've submitted to you. You'll want to ask them about sort of opportunities and constraints that they might see with the site, to give you a better sense of what the possibilities are, and also what some of the challenges are going to be with the site. Then you'll want to select a group to be your development partner. You'll check their references, and hopefully it'll be clear who you should choose, and you can make a selection. So let's see here. Let's look. We can go to the next slide. Oh yes. Then so yeah. So I guess the other thing I was going to say was that if you are working towards finding a consultant to help you with your development process, I think it's probably better to be very specific about what you want from them. If you're looking to have a developer, if you're doing an RFP to select a developer to help you with developing a site, I think I think there's some value in having maybe some very basic parameters, but not being overly prescriptive about what you're asking them to do. And the reason for that is that I think that you can sometimes solicit information and get ideas about what is possible at your site that you might not have been able to get if you were really prescriptive about what you are asking the developers to ultimately provide. So, so I think it's worthwhile to kind of allow for some flexibility and some more creativity, when developers are proposing. But when you're hiring a consultant to help you navigate that selection process and help you navigate the development process, I think you can be much more specific about what you're looking for from that person or from that firm. Okay, next slide. And then I think selecting a partner or negotiating a partnership. So this can be probably one of the most challenging pieces of the development process, because what you're really trying to do is define roles and responsibilities. You're trying to establish priorities for what you're trying to do, and also you're really looking towards, even though you might have a very friendly relationship with your potential partner, the people that you're working with now might not be the same people working on the project 3 or 4 years from now. Something could happen on another project that the developer's working on that, throws their organization into financial turmoil. There are just all these things that can happen, and, your agreement with them is really what's going to protect you from situations where you can't agree on things. So, so I think, my advice on this is to, I mean, one, you really have to have your own attorney to help represent your interests, and to help you with negotiating your agreement, with your development partner. And then I think the other thing is, to maybe put aside the actual agreement itself, and sort of have a checklist of things that, you of, I guess, different sort of responsibilities that are going to be, part of the development process. So, for example, who's going to be responsible for community outreach? How much outreach are they going to be responsible for? Who's going to be responsible for overseeing the architect and, providing direction to them about what you want or don't want in the design? Who's going to be responsible for, providing, or for securing the entitlements necessary to, build the building? And similarly, like with financing, with social services that will need to be provided on site for the construction closing, monitoring the construction draws, to make sure the contractor's getting paid. Who's going to take the lead in selecting the contractor? Is that going to be a joint decision? Is it something that you need to approve, or is it something you just need to be informed about? I mean, those are the kinds of questions you're going to need to ask yourself ahead of time. And also, I think it's really important to determine, what are the modes of communication? Do you need to have a weekly meeting? Do you need to, or do you want to be less involved, where you are just notified, whenever something big comes up? Oh, we're going to apply for some financing now. We just wanted to let you know. Or do you need to be part of that financing application? Do you need to review it? Do you need to be a co-applicant? So those are the kinds of things that are going to need to be reflected in your, partnership agreement or joint venture agreement or memorandum of understanding, whatever it's going to be. I think I think that's my last slide. I don't think I have anything else when I advance to the next one. So if folks have any questions about sort of that initial assessment, or RFP process, I'm happy to take questions now or later after everyone's through. Okay.
Thanks, Yasmin.
Thank you.
Certainly, yeah. If along the way people have questions, we're open to those at any time. I didn't know if I was supposed to now announce the next speaker, but I'm happy to do that. Laura Regas, who is the real estate director. Although, is she still here? Where did she go?
I'm right here.
Oh, there she is. Hi. Yeah, I see you now. Thank you. The real estate director at Vice President, Senior. What is your fancy title?
Senior Vice President of Development.
Senior Vice President of Development at Abode Communities, but most importantly, the chair of the SCAMP Policy Committee and a SCAMP board member. Well, all right, why don't you take us to the next.
Thanks, Alan. And hello, everybody. We used to do these in person, and I'm sorry I can't see all your faces, but Zoom is a great way for lots of people to attend. So I hope to see or hear from you along the way with some Q&A. So, my topic is fairly large. There's a lot we could talk about around project feasibility and site analysis. For those of you, some of this may just be, it already. For others of you, hopefully this is helpful. My goal is to really share with you kind of how a developer approaches an opportunity and things that we think about that I think will also be instructive and helpful for those of you on the public agency side who are coming at it from that perspective and wanting to think about, how to put forward a site that would really work well. So please feel free to ask me questions along the way. And if I don't see your question, I'm sure one of my colleagues will holler at me if I've missed something. So really quickly, this is what we're going to talk a little bit about, kind of the first cut at where do we find sites and how do we analyze them? What can we build? How much does it cost? Because that is such a big deal? Is there enough financing to pay for it? What's the support look like in that area? And then once we feel like we've got a good site, what do we do with it from there in terms of moving forward, risk management? And then we'll talk a little bit more about kind of zoning and entitlements, which is sort of weaved in and out of this. And then I hope that a few of these things may spur questions or comments from you all too. So let's go to the next slide. So in general, there's a lot of different ways where we find sites for development of affordable housing. For many of you, it's mostly, your domain is through kind of the RFP process, which we really appreciate. And I think Yasmin's comments about how do you get ready for an RFP are really critical. The best RFPs that we've worked on are the ones where the public agency team has really thought through all of the parameters and the goals, and they've asked a lot of questions of their kind of city or county family teams before they even put the document out. So it's really, really clear. One of the things that developers love is certainty, right? And good information and transparency. So, but these kinds of RFPs can come from different places, cities, counties, transportation agencies. We've done some with school districts. I think, the whole thing with Surplus Land Act, those opportunities kind of also fall into this category. And then, of course, we find things on the market, either, publicly listed or what they call, privately or pocket listing. Could be vacant land. It could be an existing building that we want to rehab, or it might be like an adaptive reuse opportunity, which we're, starting to do more and more of, something that's not housing that will become housing. Sometimes it means we have to demolish what's there and then rebuild to a higher density. And then, of course, there are partnership opportunities. Yasmin mentioned some examples with churches or their nonprofit organizations. At Abode Communities, we actually have a couple of really exciting and fun partnerships with market rate developers who have an inclusionary requirement. And so we've kind of teamed up and are working with a city or a county on these kind of bigger mixed income master planned opportunities. Of course, the bigger and more complicated they are, the longer they take, but sometimes you get some really interesting and exciting finished products. And then, of course, a few other places that we will often, discover opportunities are through the passage or the forthcoming passage of a new specific or a community plan or a housing element. Now, a word about housing elements really quickly. In past years, they weren't the best source for finding sites because, as many of you know, they weren't often the most realistic in terms of what those sites could be in terms of feasibility. But I think that they've gotten much better. And I think many of you are working on housing elements and really working hard on finding sites that are truly feasible for development. So lots of good ways to find sites out there. Let's go to the next slide. So next up is just a rough cut at, we're starting to look at a site. What are the things that we need to know right away? First of all, how big is that site? And once we know how big that site is, we can right away figure out pretty quickly, kind of a back of the envelope, how many units we can fit there. And if that number of units is enough for us to kind of have a critical mass of units for financial feasibility, we can talk more about that later if you have questions. Of course, we want to know right away, what's the zoning, what's the general plan? If we need some adjustments in order to make this proposed project work, is there a favorable process to go through in terms of entitlements and land use approvals? Or is it going to be a really difficult and long, full environmental impact report process, which we tend to avoid, quite honestly, in terms of options for sites that have a much faster kind of streamlined process, or even a buy right process, which is very few and far between. And then, of course, where is that site located? Is it in proximity to all these really important amenities? And amenities is a good thing to mention here for two reasons. One, just for quality of life, right? We want to be developing affordable housing in an area that has all these opportunities for families and seniors and folks to thrive, easy access to get to things. But it's also important from a financial perspective because these are really critical threshold items that we've got to have in some combination, depending on the project, in order to even be competitive for competing for funding at the state level, and sometimes even at the regional level. So lots of things just at a quick look, we've got to get a handle on right away. Let's go to the next slide. So a little bit more on that. What's the current zoning? What's the general plan use? Is there any discrepancy between the general plan and the current zoning? If so, there might be a tool out there with SB 35 that we can use to reconcile those. We can talk more about that later. The other thing is, what kind of project are we building? Are we doing family? Are we doing senior? Are we doing permanent supportive housing? We need to, we as developers or as partners with you as public agencies, right away, we need to know what we're building, because obviously that the sizes of those units are different, and some of the things that go with them are different. And we need to have a sense right away of what we can fit. Do we need to have other kinds of non-residential spaces in that building? Now, there are some that we always put in our developments, right? We need office space, we need a community room. But in some jurisdictions, sometimes there's a requirement to have retail at the ground floor, or maybe through a special RFP process, there's a goal of having something else there, like a childcare center, or something else there that we've got to account for in terms of space, footprint, any additional open space that goes with that. So there's a lot to calculate up front. And then of course, everyone's favorite topic, how much parking is required there? And obviously that number changes depending on what kind of project we're building, where the site is located, how great the access to transit is, and then overlaying what land use process we might use. So for example, if we're using the state density bonus and it's 100% affordable housing project, we know that the parking requirements are a little bit different. Or the city or the county we're working in might have already adopted some other kind of progressive affordable housing ordinance that minimizes the amount of parking depending on the type of project it is. So that helps us figure out what the footprint is and how much space we need. And then of course we want to look at height, because height also has an impact on cost, as many of you know. So if it's 4 stories or less, we know that typically one of our public funding sources will require the payment of prevailing wages. And so there's kind of 2 categories of those wage requirements. So 4 stories or less has the slightly less expensive residential prevailing wage model. And if it's 5 stories or more, we know that we have to shift over to the payment of commercial prevailing wages, which is a little bit more expensive. So right away, we're taking all this information in based on our own kind of cost and knowledge database and figuring out what we think that project is likely going to cost. And then, as I mentioned, what's the land use approval process going to look like? Is there something that we would need in order to make this project feasible from the city or county's land use approval side to make it all fit so that we can get through the process and have the approval to ultimately submit plans to the building department? And depending on how complicated that process is, we may or may not decide that this is a great site for us. Maybe everything else worked except for this last bullet, and we say, yeah, you know what? It's just going to take too long. It'll be too expensive, or it's too complicated because there's likely just not enough political support for it. Let's go to the next slide. So all of those things we kind of take into consideration, and Bill's going to talk a lot more about financing and costs, but this is just a quick look at all of the things that we're kind of thinking of up front, because not only do we figure out at the front end what we want to build, how we might pay for it in the interim, but we also have to know at the back end, like, what are our permanent sources? So we're kind of working through all 3 phases: pre-development, construction, and perm. Right up front, we have to figure out what those are. And there's critical costs that drive those, obviously. Many of you know that construction costs just continue to increase, and we're in a particularly volatile construction cost market right now. And so what developers are having to do around cost escalation and building extra cushion and contingency in has a big impact on the financial feasibility of that project, and then figuring out how much money do we need to go secure to ultimately have enough to get us to the start of construction. And so it may be that the current environment requires us to layer on an extra level of financing that we might not have otherwise pursued. So a lot of factors in here. Now, as public agencies, you don't have to know what all of these costs are. That's our job as developers. But you might have an eye or some feedback on a couple of these things, or some public agencies really want to take a close look at our budgets and what are we assuming and why. And so that's always a conversation we're happy to have and kind of walk our partners through what our different assumptions are. Let's go to the next slide. So again, Bill's going to talk a lot more about this, but this is like a really kind of quick and dirty how we think about financing upfront right away. So we've made it through the site analysis. We think we know how many units we're going to be able to build, and we know what kind of units those are, and we've put together a rough affordability mix, so we know what the rents are. So we put all that into our model, and we figure out, okay, based on that kind of project, I know that I'm going to generate this much rent from tenants, and if it's a project that has permanent supportive housing in it, and we think there's going to be like a Section 8 rental subsidy, we can account for that. And then we start to detract from that. Okay, what will it cost to operate? What are the other expenses I need to account for? Resident services, or some sort of special tax or assessment, or, replacement reserves, all the typical things that we have to work through in terms of what it looks like when you're operating. We figure out what that net operating income is. We apply a debt coverage ratio, and that gets us basically to the point where we can figure out how much of a permanent mortgage we can leverage based on that project's rental and affordability mix. So if we go to the next page, you'll see that that really kind of drives the rest of the financing work. We kind of work backwards then. So in this particular hypothetical model where 60 units cost $450,000 each, I wish they all cost that much. Some of them cost more. We figure out, okay, well, this is our total development cost, and we figured out how much of a mortgage we can leverage just based on that affordable rent. Now we have this huge funding gap that we have to fill. Okay, how do we do that? So then we work through our list of known sources, the low-income housing tax credits, any kind of financing that might be available from our partners at the city or the county. What are the different programs we can apply for in Sacramento that are mostly administered through the Housing and Community Development Department? Is there any other kind of federal or grant program? We layer everything in and we figure out, okay, we're going to need X number of sources to get us there to have a financially feasible project. And then we start tweaking and we figure out, okay, well, what's plan B? What if we don't get this one? Is the project set up in a way that we could pursue this one over here? And so that's how developers think. We usually have a plan A and a plan B, and sometimes we have a plan C too. So it really just depends. So we're ready as the environment changes, because as you guys know, financing affordable housing takes some time, right? So we don't have all the financing in place on day one, because typically you have to go through your land use entitlement process first, then you apply for your first set of financing, and then it's usually a series. Now that time frame is starting to get compressed, which is really great, as HCD in Sacramento is starting to batch together a number of the funding programs that they administer. So you could apply to a bunch of them at once, but it's not all quite layered on at one time, but we're getting there. So let's go to the next slide. So another word about, okay, it looks like it's developable in terms of, what you could engineer and build there. We think we've got a financing plan. What's the community support look like for this? And this is such a critical piece, as Yasmin mentioned. If you're a public agency and you're putting together an RFP, hopefully lots of thinking has already gone into what that community engagement process looks like. We've worked with some city and county partners who have done community engagement about a site before they've ever even released an RFP, which is really great. But sometimes that doesn't happen. And so we need to have a plan for what's that engagement look like, and who are our local champions in terms of our elected officials, and what's the process going to look like. This is a key piece of the assessment for us as developers to figure out whether or not we've truly got a site that we would consider viable, that we want to move forward with. Let's go to the next slide. So if we think we've got a real viable site here and it's a private market transaction, typically what our business development team is doing is we're hoping to see if we can get a seller that will be patient and give us a long escrow that gives us time to kind of work through a number of these typical phases or hurdles in the development process. Sometimes we don't have a patient seller. It really depends on the market, as many of you know. And we have to do a quick close. And so we've got to line up our acquisition financing as well and account for the interest cost that comes with that in our overall model. Excuse me for a minute. Now, when we're working with our public agency partners, that piece goes away, which is really nice. So we don't have to worry about carrying costs and all that front end extra risk management with a loan. But there are significant pre-development costs no matter what which type of project you're doing. And those we factor in terms of all the consultants and things that we're going to be doing in order to get a project to the point, one, where it's entitled, and then it's ready for financing, and then ultimately ready to start construction. So let's go to the next slide. So this is just a quick snapshot of generally what the timeline has looked like for affordable housing projects on average. Now, some are longer, some are a little bit shorter, but you can see that the average here, I'm so sorry, our household is recovering from COVID. You can see that the average here takes a couple of years just to get to the construction start point. And then construction usually takes somewhere between 15 and 20 months, depending on the project. And then we need time to get through the lease up and stabilization process. And so this is important information to share with our partners as well as the community when we're talking about a new project that's in the works. And so we have to think about if we're buying a piece of land, accounting for all the time and the interest that we'll carry with this. So sorry about the coffee. I may have to pause for a minute. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So a couple more thoughts about costs. In a high cost environment, we really want to make sure that we've got a streamlined project that doesn't have a lot of extras that are going to cost more money than we think we can secure in terms of other financing available. I am going to have to pause, guys. I'm sorry.
Of course. Let's see. Just looking to see if there are any good questions in here. Looks like we're discussion about the slides. Paveo, do you want to maybe?
I was just going to echo something Laura had mentioned, which is that I am going to cover in some greater detail some of the points she's hitting on in terms of how do you pay for all this? But she's making really good points about sort of the phases of financing involved, et cetera. So, but more on that to come.
Why don't we jump to the next couple of slides and just flip through them really quickly? Because I think a lot of this is just going to reiterate the critical points of what do you need to look for in a site and other things to keep in mind. So if you're a jurisdiction that doesn't yet have, I would call it more sophisticated or policies in place for multifamily housing, there is legislation at the state level that helps us kind of work through that. I've mentioned the state density bonus as one. But these are the kind of factors that we're looking at in terms of what we need to account for when we are thinking about the feasibility of the project. So it's not just about height or number of units, but we've got to figure out if there's any floor area ratio requirements, lot size, setbacks, that sort of thing. Let's go to the next slide. Just a quick word on this. I've never seen a by right project. We would love to have one. We're getting close with some of these kind of streamlined ministerial land use approval processes, but it's certainly tough. So from the public agency side, the more that you all can do to get a site ready that has the right kind of zoning that is most friendly to multifamily affordable housing development, the better off we all are, because we can kind of zoom through that process and get to the point where we are applying for financing and getting to construction as soon as possible. Let's go to the next slide. Most of you know this because I think most of you work at public agency partners or you had some experience going through the development process, but there is, there's an end result when you get through the land use approval process. And there's a document that kind of sets the rules, the conditions of approval for you to move forward with. That's a really important document for us too, because it gives us the certainty, but it's also some of the evidence we need to submit to the state when we're applying for funding, that yes, we've been through the process, we have all the approvals we need, everybody's on the same page, there's not going to be an issue going forward where we said we can build 60 units, but actually you're only allowed to build 40, like everything has been sorted through. Let's go to the next page. A few other things here that are worth mentioning in terms of site feasibility that I didn't mention earlier. And when architects give this part of the presentation, they love to talk about some of these things because they always get us into trouble if we haven't taken a close look at some of these things. One of our favorite issues is utility wires and other easements or other utilities that could potentially create some challenges for the project that we didn't take into consideration. This is a big one, and depending on what jurisdiction you're in and who your utility provider is, it may be that you want to build something in an area that in order to accommodate that new project, utility wires may have to actually be undergrounded. That is always an expensive and timely process. So we want to know ahead of time what the expectations are around some of these other issues. What's happening with the slope and the soils? Do we have any kind of problems with the dirt there, so to speak? What will we have to do to mitigate it? That kind of thing. What is the fire department going to be expecting? Have we accounted for that? Can we meet with them early? What else is out there in terms of any other issues? Is there any kind of existing structure on the site that has a historic potential that we need to account for? That sort of thing. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Sorry all for having to pause off and on. I don't want you to hear all the coughing. So a couple of just reminders as we move into the next section. I'm happy to take questions in just a second. Again, let's have a site that kind of has done its homework through our partnership early. We know what we can build there. It's pretty straightforward. We know what's happening with utility. Do we have, is it going to be able to serve the new units that are built there? Sometimes we find in certain jurisdictions, we want to build a 100-unit project and the power company says, we don't have enough power in the neighborhood to account for that. You're going to have to pay to upgrade the system, from this street to this street. We want to know that early, and the partnership with the utility company and our local jurisdiction is really critical to that. Ultimately, and I think Yasmin really underscored this well, the best projects are the ones where we have this great, open, strong, trusting working relationship with our public partners, because we all have got the same goal. We know what we're good at, they know what they're good at, and we bring our kind of powers together and figure out, okay, how do we as a team get this project to the finish line? What are the hurdles we're likely to face? Who's going to do what? Circle back, what's our plan B? How do we attack it? So those are really the best and honestly most fun projects, and I think ultimately have the best success when we bring the community along with us. I think we've got maybe one more slide. I feel like this is almost a repeat. So again, the worst case scenario in our mind is we have to go through a ministerial only process to get to our land use approvals. We really don't want to tangle with a long and complicated EIR process or something that is discretionary and is at risk of a lawsuit by someone who is just anti-affordable housing and just wants to stop the project. And so the best projects really are the quick ones that are straightforward and don't have too many complications with them. I know that it's easy to say and hard to do, but we have found that it is possible with the right kind of planning and the right partnership and the right site. So I think we can skip the next slide because it says the same thing again. So I think that's it for me. Thank you all. I can't tell if we have a few questions. I'm happy to answer them before Bill takes over.
There are a few questions. There's one from the chat, Laura. So is there a move towards more modular construction to lower the per unit costs and lower prevailing wage cost?
Yeah, absolutely. So Abode Community is actually working on a few modular projects. I would say that they're still early enough on that we haven't yet, we're not the place where we can say absolutely modular is X% cheaper and it's a go-to every time for this kind of project. Right now we're testing it on some projects that are studios for permanent supportive housing. We have one under construction and a couple more in the works. So about a year from now, you should ask me that same question and I'll let you know how the numbers are looking. We think that definitely we're going to save money because we're going to save some time in terms of the construction period. What the part that's more up in the air is whether or not the actual cost to construct the units is significantly cheaper, or I'll say just a little bit cheaper. And that's the part that we're still working through. I think it's going to take a couple of projects to kind of iron out and figure out, okay, where do we need to refine some things in our design and engineering process? What do we need to figure out in the field with our general contractor and our modular builder? But we're really excited about where it's going. Overall, it does have a lot of promise, but I think the jury is still out on the actual, like, you know, we want to put this in writing in a white paper and say, this is what you can expect.
Great. And there's another question here from Albert. Is there an alternative plan if the developer cannot secure public subsidies, tax credits to meet the funding gap?
So that's a great question. Typically, most affordable housing projects, as you'll hear from Bill, are financed with low-income housing tax credits, and then we subsidize with some of those other local, regional, and state programs. We have a couple of projects in the works, one in particular where we have a large corporation and a very motivated county that is interested in trying out a project, and this is a modular project as well, that doesn't use tax credits. So it is possible, but it takes a significant amount of contribution from other sources in order to pull that off. In the case of a tax credit project that is just coming up a little bit short in terms of subsidy, we have had positive experiences working with other foundations who can sometimes fill a gap if it's a type of project that they're interested in. Say, for example, a project that serves homeless transition age youth, which are young adults who have come out of the foster care system. So there are opportunities here and there to fill some gaps, but if we're talking like multi-million-dollar gaps, it's a very different kind of conversation and approach. And so what we try to do is to design a project that could pivot to a couple of different public funding sources out there, but still retains the overall structure of a tax credit project, knowing in the back of our mind that, hey, worst case scenario, we may have to go back and redesign it to make it something else that qualifies for a different category of funding that we maybe hadn't thought of before. It wasn't the original goal, but it's always an important discussion to have as you kind of get through the process and figure out what's working and what's not working.
There's two questions about the development timeline process. So one person asks, do those estimates overlap? And someone else asks, are there certain parts of that timeline process that happen simultaneously?
Jeanette, can you flip back to that slide? Or maybe I can pull it up on my end and I'll just look at it while we're chatting.
Yeah, we'll flip back.
So there is a little bit of overlap. So it's a good question. Typically in the concept, design, and entitlements phase, we're not typically able to pursue most financing sources. So we've got to work through that phase before we can really get into actively pursuing financing. But typically, there it is. Thank you, Jeanette. But typically what happens is as we start to get into the period of securing the various financing sources, we will move our architects and our engineers along. It will keep the process going because typically it goes pretty smoothly. Like we expect as a developer to be able to secure, you know, this source from the county. Okay, we got that source. Great, we're doing well. Keep them going. The only time we tend to pause is if it looks like something has significantly changed from our expectations or something going on in the market, you know, there's something unusual that's happening, and then we'll pause them. Otherwise, we tend to start to overlap the construction drawings and the plan check while we're waiting for those final, you know, couple of rounds of financing. And one of the reasons is that important to do is when we finally get to tax credits, which Bill will talk a lot about, Once we get our tax credit award, we have got to close and start construction within 6 months of that award. And there's really no room to adjust that. So we've got to know that our drawings are ready, and we've kind of estimated how long it will take to get through that plan check process. That gives us enough time to not only get them permitted, but for our general contractor to bid them out. And also leaves time for us to make any adjustments if the bid comes back higher than we thought and we need to do some value engineering and dial things back. So there is some overlap in that middle phase there.
Great. And someone else asked, are there credits available or special considerations for tiny home developments? Or what about the use of solar or alternative green building methods?
I'm not aware of low-income housing tax credits being available for tiny homes, but I'm going to defer that question to Bill later in case he knows something that I don't. There are credits available for solar, and that's typically incorporated into the estimating that we do with our potential limited partner. And I think they're called federal energy business credits. So it's not something that comes from the state, so to speak, that you apply for at the state level, but they're incorporated into our assumptions what the limited partnership can ultimately be awarded or account for on their tax return. And Bill, maybe you should say a word about that later when we get to more of the credit detail. Did I miss any part of that question there, Jeanette?
I think that covers it. And then there's just one more question about whether Abode provides consulting services. I'll just say Yasmin Tong, our first speaker, is a development consultant, but I don't know if Abode does too.
Yeah, we typically don't do the kind of consulting work that I'm guessing you guys are asking about, and we would refer you to a consultant like Yasmin in particular. But often what happens is a jurisdiction may reach out to us and say what we'll call just sole source and say, hey, we want to work with you on this particular site, or what do you think? And that's a conversation we'd be happy to have. But if it's something where you're ultimately going to do an RFP, then I would encourage you to reach out to a consultant team like Yasmin's.
All right, and we have 2 minutes left. So one more question. Are inclusionary fees / linkage fees for non-residential projects proving to be a viable resource to subsidize affordable housing?
That's such a great question. I will say that in most cases so far, we have not seen projects that are able to tap into a significant amount of fees that we're able to eliminate one or more of the other public funding sources that we might otherwise apply for. I think sometimes what's happening is the fees themselves are not high enough, and so they don't quite capture, kind of unit per unit, the cost of construction. And then in other cases, I think just the projections about when the fee structure was put in place and where we are in today's cost environment, there's a gap there, right? And so they don't quite pencil out. They are certainly valuable, please don't get me wrong. But what I think we're seeing is that it's just not enough to completely close the gap, and where you could just have, say, linkage fees, and I'll call it free land and a tax credit award. Usually we need another source in there, another source or two in there from one of our public agency programs.
Great, thank you. So we will move on to Bill.
Thanks, everybody. And I'm so sorry for the coughing. Thank you for being patient.
All right, Bill, you have a full hour to get through.
Okay, very good. Thanks. And good job, Laura. And hang in there. Hope you're feeling okay. So this next portion of this morning's presentation is really going to focus on and really complement what you've just heard about from the prior two presenters, as they described to you all of the activities that go into getting projects ready for development and ultimately developing and operating those properties. Developers are always thinking about how on earth am I going to pay for all this? So that's what we're talking about in this second half of the session explicitly, is how do affordable housing developers, and again, we're talking about primarily multifamily rental development, Did I wink out there for a second?
Yeah, Bill, it just
Okay.
froze for a second.
It froze. Okay. Am I back?
You're back.
Okay, cool. All right. So you've heard some of this already, so I'm going to cover it very briefly. But just to kind of give you the big picture again of how developers think about financing all of this. And again, let me pause here. As I go through this, two things. You're going to hear my clock in the background. And then two, I'm going to move fairly quickly through this. I may slip into using some jargon, so please don't hesitate to ask questions as I go through this, because it is dense and can be confusing. As a matter of fact, you'll probably hear me get confused on occasion. So please don't hesitate, and I think the presentation goes better if we get lots of questions. So this slide is showing you what Laura was hearkening to, which is kind of these three phases of development and thinking about financing development. The first is that capital funding piece, meaning how am I going to pay to get this property developed? So that's kind of one piece of the puzzle. How am I going to pay to get this thing built? The second thing developers think about very early in the process is, once I get this property built, how am I going to pay to operate it? So I'm going to collect rents, and Laura had a slide where she showed you, you collect rents, so the property is going to have rental income, but the property is also going to have operating expenses, and so those expenses are going to take a bite out of that income, and it's going to leave some net operating income off of which you can borrow funds. But a developer has to think about all of that in advance of developing the property to make sure this property is going to be feasible once we get it built. And that third box is showing you that more and more often today, developers are having to think carefully about services that are going to be delivered to the residents at those properties, and how is the developer going to make sure those services get paid for? Are they going to be paid for out of rental income, or is the developer going to need to line up some alternative source of revenue to pay for those services, be it from the county, perhaps, who's delivering services or paying for some services that are coming into the property, or some other funding source? But it is definitely a cost during operation that developers have to think about in advance and sort out how to cover. This slide, I actually regret not updating this slide, because I know Laura had a slide earlier too that I think had slightly different figures. These numbers have all gone up pretty dramatically recently. So I think I did some research and came up with these numbers sort of mid-COVID. As COVID progressed, and then as we have been coming out of the pandemic, these costs have really skyrocketed. So you might add 10 to 20% to all of these costs here. So my experience these days is in the greater Los Angeles area, for example, it is going to be the rare bird that comes in under $600,000 a unit. So I just, I want to prepare you for sticker shock here. These developments cost a lot to put together. So these numbers are, again, probably on the low side. You ought to add 10 or perhaps even 20% to these numbers to get to the real cost you might anticipate as you see developments in your communities. Okay, next slide. All right, so these are kind of I'm talking about that first box you saw in the earlier slide where it had capital expenses, kind of the development of the project. Then it had operating expenses, and then it had services expenses. What I'm going to be talking to you from this point forward is that development or capital funding phase. So how do we get this development built? And again, Laura talked about sort of this sequence of events that you see in this slide. She also noted in response to a question that while, for example, I'm presenting most of this as if it happens in very distinct phases, there's a lot of overlap, and it is not as sequential necessarily as I'm presenting it. But just to help you think about these things, this is kind of a good graphic to show you the various phases of financing that a developer has to consider as they put a deal together. So that pre-development phase, that includes things like identifying and gaining control of the site. And that may involve purchasing the site or putting cash down to gain control, to have an option to purchase the site at some point in the near future. It involves architectural costs, all the staffing costs associated with squaring away any zoning requirements and other land use requirements, conducting and participating in community meetings and public hearings. All of that pre-development phase involves costs, and the developer has to figure out, how am I going to pay for those costs? And there is an industry of sorts that developers go to that provides pre-development funding. And so they'll have a bundle of costs at that pre-development phase, and they will have a source of financing to cover those costs. The second phase is that actual construction period, as the name implies. So, once all the financing is kind of squared away and they get underway with the building of the project, that's kind of a separate funding package. And again, there are industries that are set up to fund that phase of the development. And frankly, that phase of development has from a lender's perspective, kind of a different risk profile. It's usually shorter in duration. So that construction period is going to be, maybe 2 to 3 years. So that's going to be the duration of the loan. And the things that can go wrong during that period from a lender's perspective are different from both the pre-development phase and the permanent phase of the project. So there's kind of a separate dynamic around funding that construction phase. And then finally, there's that permanent financing phase. And again, you heard Laura refer to that permanent financing picture and the various sources that are available to get you there. And that really is once the project is completed. And I think somebody even asked a question about, what does stabilized mean? It means the development is occupied and rents are being collected for a period of time to the point where, okay, this property is now up and running in a way that is now sort of stable and predictable going forward. So the rents are coming in, the operating expenses are being paid, any debt service on loans is being covered. It's stabilized and operating. That permanent phase of the development has a separate financing package that stays with the property for 15 to 30 years or more. I should mention just before we leave this slide that each of those financing phases, among other things, pays off the financing from the prior phase, either pays off or significantly pays down. So for example, when you get your construction period financing, one of the first things a developer will do is pay off their pre-development loan. And in the permanent financing package, one of the first things that's being paid off with that permanent financing package arriving upon completion is let's pay off or significantly pay down that construction period financing. Okay, so separate financing packages, and some of the costs of those subsequent packages is to pay off the prior package or pay it down. Okay, so I see there are things in the chat and Q&A. Are there some questions? Maybe I'll pause here.
Yeah, there is a question about costs. He notes, as you see that cost has gone up approximately 20%, do you see that increase in cost because of the value of land, or is it the product, i.e. the building, or is it a mix of both?
Yeah, see, here's where Laura might be able to help me out a little bit, but my sense is, and I should mention, I sit, among other things, on the board of a nonprofit affordable housing developer, and my sense is construction costs have gone through the roof, and that includes materials and labor costs. In part, there's kind of either a shortage or a supply chain problem with those, especially in the materials category. Land costs, it probably varies from community to community, but I suspect land costs are also climbing up. Laura, I don't know if you want to add anything about what's been contributing recently to escalating costs.
Yeah, it's certainly much more on the construction cost side than the land side, although of course in certain markets, as you note, Bill, land is going up, but we've seen a spike just in the last few months because of global supply chain problems and additional labor shortages, where some projects are suddenly 15, 20% more expensive than they were 5 months ago.
Yep. Okay. Were there other questions?
And there's just one more question about financing options for disinvested and historically excluded communities that do not have the available capital to leverage. For example, tribal communities struggle to successfully apply for grants like Home Key because of the limited upfront capital available. How might we tackle this issue?
That's a good question. Yeah, historically disinvested communities statewide are challenged in terms of coming up with resources. And as you'll see, as we go through the financing discussion, you know, local contributions, local resources coming into the deal are really so vital. And so if a community does lack those resources, it is tough. I should mention too, just in all candor, the low-income housing tax credit program up until about, I'm going to say maybe 8 to 10 years ago, had never done a deal on tribal land, and only about, like I say, 8 to 10 years ago did they actually have kind of what in essence is a little set aside of tax credits for developments on tribal lands. So there is that, but the bigger question is, where do I get the local resources? And again, if you're in an incorporated city, then maybe looking to the city to help provide some resources. More typically, in my experience with the tax credit program, Native American communities were frequently in rural areas, and rural areas generally are challenged in coming up with local contributions to fill the financing package. So I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but I guess I'm just acknowledging, yeah, that is a challenge to come up with local resources that are really so vital to make up part of the package that goes into financing these deals. I don't know if maybe one of the other presenters has thoughts on this. No? Okay, that's, were there other questions?
That's it for now.
Okay, all right, then why don't we go on to the next slide? Okay, so again, some of this was touched upon in earlier presentations, but just to kind of quickly kind of define our terms, if you will. That first box on the left is talking about just conventional debt or conventional, frequently referred to as hard loans, meaning hard debt. It's you might think of it kind of like a home mortgage loan, if you will, where you're going to get a loan. It frequently has a fixed interest rate, although it could be variable interest rate. Same is true here. But ideally a fixed interest rate, and it's got a fixed repayment schedule. So for example, in a home mortgage scenario, every month you're going to need to make a payment. The same is true with conventional debt that is being brought in to help cover development costs for affordable rental housing. It is also just like a home mortgage. It's secured by a deed of trust against the property. Now, if the land is being leased by the developer, then that's a slightly different method of securing the loan. But the bottom line is that conventional debt will be secured either by a deed of trust against the property, the improvements and the land, or the improvements and the leasehold interest in the land. So that conventional debt, again, must pay debt is typically part of the financing package. The really critical and somewhat unusual part, in contrast to a home mortgage, for example, is a soft loan. That's that middle box. And what that is typically referring to is a loan from typically a public funding source. So that could be the county, it could be the city in which the development is taking place, it could be the state of California. But the defining feature of a soft loan is that the terms of repayment are flexible. And you'll hear more about that in an upcoming slide, but they are frequently structured to look for payments only as revenues are available during the operation of the development once it's up and running. These loans are secured, though, also by deeds of trust, and also are typically accompanied by a regulatory agreement by that public entity. That is, the public entity is putting in this loan with very generous terms for a public purpose, and they're memorializing that public purpose in a regulatory agreement. So they're typically restricting the incomes of the folks that the developer is going to rent to. They're restricting the rents that can be charged, and they've got other mandates around how the property should be maintained and what kind of reporting should go on annually to that public entity. That third box is probably sort of self-descriptive. And a third source is cash that does not require repayment. And that can be in the form of either a grant from a funding source. So there are funding sources out there that in essence will make money available without the expectation of repayment. Or more typically, the cash coming in without the expectation of a repayment is equity. And again, think of equity as paralleling the down payment in a mortgage, in a home purchase scenario. So in a home purchase, that home is purchased with a combination of debt, typically hard debt, of course, from a bank, let's say, and equity, a down payment. So that equity is coming from the owner, and the same is true here. And that is going to lead us into that discussion of the low-income housing tax credit program. Okay. All right. I think we can move on to the next slide unless there are any questions. No. Okay. Here's more information on those soft loans, those really important soft loans. Again, these are frequently, typically from public entities, cities, counties, the state of California. Their interest rate is usually below market, so think 0 to 4%. The interest rate is simple, meaning if interest is accruing, you are not going to be paying interest on that accruing interest. So unlike a credit card, for example, where if you make a minimum payment on your credit card, and so some of the accrued interest is now, in essence, part of the principal on that credit card, that interest is now, you're going to be paying interest on that accrued interest. That is not true with these soft loans typically. Typically, they are simple. So if the development, for example, in a given year is unable to make a payment on that public loan, some interest is accruing, and it's going to be sort of a below market interest, but it is accruing. But that accrued interest is not then going to be a source of additional interest earned on the principal. Kind of garbled that a little bit, but I think you get the idea. If you don't, let me know in a Q&A. The payments are typically made to that public lender only if at the end of the year, for example, there is cash flow remaining. That is, rent was collected, operating expenses were paid, reserves received deposits, hard debt was paid, and there is still some cash left at the end of the year. Only then would a soft loan lender look for some payment. And so it's frequently referred to as a residual receipts payment, meaning you've paid all your bills and you still have some residual left. Only then would that public lender look for a payment that year out of those residual receipts. Principal and interest simply accrue over time. Frequently, these public loans also are very long-term. 55 years isn't unusual. So unlike a 30-year mortgage or a 15-year mortgage, frequently these are 55-year loans. If you're wondering, well, what happens in year 55 if you've got both principal and a big chunk of interest remaining unpaid? To be honest with you, and again, I used to work with the State Department of Housing, repayment is not the primary objective of that agency. The primary objective of that agency is to provide funding that gets this public benefit, which is affordable rents for income qualified folks. And that repayment scenario, year 55, perhaps that loan gets extended if the property owner is amenable to extending the regulatory agreement. But that 55-year repayment is kind of conceptual at this point. The public lender may require some annual payment just to cover their administrative expenses. And again, invariably, these soft loans require long-term affordability that accompanies those really generous terms on the loan. Okay, all right, next slide. This is just, I'm not going to really drill down here. I think it came up in Laura's presentation about cities and counties, in some cases, receive federal funds directly for housing purposes. I mentioned a couple of them here. Home and CDBG are federal funding sources that go frequently directly to cities and unincorporated counties. So those are sources of funding for the city to then, for the county to participate in financing a development. Beyond those federal sources, that second box there shows you sometimes localities will set up local housing trust funds, and you might think of that as just kind of a bucket that is a receptacle for funding sources. Sometimes what goes into that bucket are those federal funding sources, as well as other sources. I've listed a couple there. It could be the local community decided to levy upon itself a little sales tax or property tax tag to generate revenue that goes into that housing trust fund bucket. It could be there are local bond sales, the proceeds of which go into that trust fund bucket. I think it was mentioned earlier, inclusionary fees. So developers of commercial properties or residential properties, and you see commercial linkage fee here, are required by the locals in some instances to contribute to a housing trust fund out of which affordable housing gets funded. So those are just a couple of examples of where locals might have some resources to make available for affordable housing developments in their communities. All right, next slide. All right, so here we are. We're going to start talking about the low-income housing tax credit program. And this first slide really just kind of gives you the basics. So this is a federal program. I've given you the acronym there. You'll see that sometimes. Some people will refer to that as LIHTC. I don't, but you might see that in writing sometimes. It was created by the Tax Reform Act of 1986. It was part of a big tax reform package at the federal level. That second bullet mentions that by that time, the federal government had really taken a giant step back from being a direct lender for affordable housing development. And yet Congress was trying to figure out a way to incentivize or participate in some way, if you will, at the federal level in the development of affordable rental housing development. And so what they came up with was a tax incentive, and that's the third bullet there, that induces in equity or cash from investors who become limited partners in the ownership structure for a given development. And by virtue of that investment, will reap tax benefits. So think banks as the primary sources of this kind of cash infusion and the primary beneficiaries, if you will, from this tax policy. But let me just stay on that ownership structure for a second. You'll see in an upcoming slide what that structure looks like a little bit visually, but and I should pause here and just tell you what I'm describing to you right now is the simplest version of this ownership structure. And there are more and more complex versions of how these things get set up. But in its simplest form, the partnership will have a general partner, and think of that as typically the developer. So in Laura's case, for example, Abode Communities would be the general partner, or some related party to Abode would be the general partner. And then in the simplest case, you'd have a single limited partner, and that would be the bank, let's say. And they would be the big contributor of that owner equity, that big cash infusion that does not expect repayment like a loan would. the ownership of that partnership, as you can see from that first sub bullet, the limited partner, in my example, the bank, is the 99.9% owner of the partnership. And the developer, think Abode Communities, for example, is a 0.01% ownership interest in that partnership. And the reason you want the limited partner to be the almost exclusive owner of that partnership is so that all the tax benefits that derive to that partnership flow to that limited partner. And to make that happen, that limited partner has to be the primary owner of that partnership. Now, you're going to hear a lot about low-income housing tax credits, which are a huge tax benefit to that partnership and ultimately that limited partner. But there are other tax benefits that derive from simply owning rental property. So, for example, if you or I were an owner of rental property, we would have access to some tax benefits like depreciation. So under federal tax law, a property loses value over time, and you can, on your tax returns, represent that as a loss against other gains in value that you might have in your investment portfolio. And so all of which is to say, these limited partners, frequently banks, are getting into these deals almost solely for the purposes of accessing these tax benefits. And that's what the low-income housing tax credit program was designed to do: induce in investors who otherwise would not invest in affordable rental housing because it's simply not going to give them a return on investment, you know, in light of the low rents that are being charged in those developments, that they would expect as a typical investment. But these tax benefits get them in the deal. That second to last bullet just explains these benefits are going to accrue to that investor over a 10-year period. So once the property is up and running, that starts a clock of 10 years, and those investors, that partnership, and ultimately those investors are going to receive a tax benefit in year 1 of operation, and they're going to receive that same tax benefit in year 2, and again in year 3, all the way out through year 10. So each year they're going to get a credit against their federal tax liability, and it's a significant credit in most cases, and so it's very beneficial to those investors. The end of that, next to the last bullet, mentions while there is 10 years of benefit, there are 15 years of federal obligation. That is, you're going to get 10 years of tax benefits, but we're going to expect 15 years of public benefit, meaning maintain the income restrictions and maintain the low rents for the full 15 years. Otherwise, there can be tax consequences. In other words, the IRS will get very active in your life if you violate the terms of that 15-year agreement. And that could include both recapture of the earlier derived benefits. So those 10 years of benefits, IRS says, I want them back. And there could be, in addition to that, penalties. So the bottom line is these investors and the partnerships generally, not only for public benefit purposes, but also just for tax consequence purposes, do not want to run afoul of those requirements. That final bullet just mentions that TCAC administers California's program here in our state. By the way, you can see that has a C at the front of it. That's the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. Most folks pronounce it TCAC, not CTAC. That's the Seattle Airport. But that is the state administering entity up in Sacramento. Okay, so next slide, unless let me pause. Are there questions?
No other questions.
Okay, thank you. As promised, here's that slide that just shows you the limited partnership owns the property in the simplest case. Partnership has a single asset, that development. The general partner, the developer, typically has a de minimis ownership interest in that partnership. Limited partner has the full blown ownership interest so that all of those limited partnership tax benefits flow right down to that limited partner. Okay, next slide. So you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. So, and you'll hear more about this in a moment, a developer is going to access these federal credits. How do they turn those credits into money? And this graphic tries to explain some of that. So the developer applies to TCAC with an application, and the application is quite lengthy, and it describes all of the features of the development. And these are competitive processes, so the application really tries to describe to TCAC that this is a really beneficial property and you ought to fund it. If the developer is successful in that competition, they get what's referred to as a reservation of credits. So they get an award letter saying, okay, we're going to hold some of these federal credits for you. But TCAC ultimately doesn't deliver those credits to the property until completion of construction. But they've got this reservation. So the developer, and again, I'm describing kind of an idealized scenario. This can happen in a variety of ways. But the developer then, in essence, goes out into the marketplace, the capital marketplace, the marketplace of big federal taxpayers who have big federal tax liabilities, who are looking to offset that federal tax liability. And that developer offers these credits to that community, and at least in one scenario will entice in bids. That is, what are you willing to pay for let's say I've got $1 million worth of federal credits here. What are you willing to pay on the dollar for $1 million worth of federal credits? And it's not unusual these days, actually, it's more and more unusual to see investors pay $1 on the dollar for a tax credit. As a matter of fact, when I first came to the tax credit committee many years ago, it wasn't unusual to see investors bidding like $1.14 on the dollar for a tax credit. And you might think, wait a minute, that's irrational. Why would you pay $1.14 for something that is really only worth $1? You know, $1 off of your federal tax exposure. Why would you pay $1.14 for that? And the reason goes back to that bundle of benefits that I mentioned. That is, as they become a partner in this partnership that owns that development, they're going to get those low-income housing tax credit benefits, but they're also going to benefit from those other tax features. They're going to benefit from that ability to account for depreciation in value of that property under tax law. And if there is accruing interest, for example, from a soft lender, they can also represent that accruing interest as a loss against other gains that would otherwise be exposed to taxation. So what was explained to me back in the day was an investor kind of looks at a low-income housing tax credit investment as really for every dollar of federal tax credit benefit I'm getting another, back then, about 35 cents of benefit as the remainder of that tax benefit bundle. And so they would say, at that time, I'll pay $1.14 to get that $1.35's worth of benefit. These days, there was a tax reform act under the Trump administration, and that took that 35-cent benefit down to about 21 cents. And so these days, an investor would probably tell you, when I buy $1 worth of tax credit, really I'm buying about $1.21's worth of aggregate tax benefit. So they are no longer willing to pay those high prices, and for other reasons as well. So these days, it is not unusual to see maybe 90 cents to 95 cents as the bid for $1's worth of low-income housing tax credit. But for our purposes, you might think about $1's worth of tax credit is going to get you about $1's worth of investment from the capital markets. Okay, now are there questions on that?
No questions on that.
Okay. All right, why don't we go ahead then to the next slide. And now we're going to kind of crunch through some basics, so we can go right to the next slide. So one of the questions you might have is, well, how much tax credit may a developer apply for? And under the federal program, The answer to that is based on a couple of factors. One of which is, what kind of low-income housing tax credit are you going for? And maybe I'll start with that box. You see the second box down says 2 types of credits, 9% credits and 4% credits. And some of you may have heard these terms. They're kind of a shorthand reference to these different types of low-income housing tax credit. One of the things I wanted to highlight for you here is that the 9% aggregate tax credit authority that's available to the state of California every year is limited by formula. So a federal formula determines how much is California going to have available to it in the form of low-income housing tax credits each year. And you're going to see that formula in an upcoming slide. The 4% credits are not limited by federal formula, but they are tied to another federal resource. And that other federal resource is tax-exempt bond financing. And you might think of tax-exempt bond financing, or at least the congressional or federal perspective was, tax-exempt bond financing is also beneficial to a development because it is a mechanism that's made available for lenders to lend to a deal by purchasing a bond or bonds and making a loan through that mechanism, if you will, to the development. And as that loan gets repaid, the interest earned on that loan is tax exempt. So one would think, okay, so since it's tax exempt, the lender would perhaps charge a lower interest rate and still be happy with the terms of that loan, because that lower interest rate is still going to bring back interest on their investment that is tax-free. And that should be accounted for in the interest rate. All of which is to say, the idea was that tax-exempt financing was going to be made available at an interest rate significantly below market interest rates. That has not been true recently because interest rates have been so low for a while here. So tax-exempt bond financing in and of itself has not been the attractive funding source for affordable housing developers that it was originally envisioned to be. But what it does do for affordable housing developers is gain them access to these 4% low-income housing tax credits. The tax-exempt bonding authority for California is also limited by formula every year. And for affordable rental housing, those tax-exempt bond proceeds, that tax-exempt bond loan, has to be large enough to cover at least half of the development costs in that development. So it has to be a pretty sizable loan. And so in essence, it does limit the amount of 4% credits that can be made available in California because there's a limited amount of bond authority available to California. All right, let's go back up to that first box. You see the formula that says percentage times basis equals the amount of credit that that development is eligible for under federal rules. So the percentage is referring to, it's either 9% or 4%. So either 9% or 4% times the basis in the deal. And we've got a slide coming up that's going to help understand what is basis in a deal. That equals the amount of low-income housing tax credit for which that development is eligible under federal rules. Let's go to the next slide. This will become clearer as we go through here. I just popped this slide in here because I also wanted you to understand that under the federal rules, they're really trying to target folks, renters, who earn 60% of the county median income or area median income. They're trying to reserve the units in these properties for households who earn that income or less. In some cases, and this was a fairly recent change in the program, you can go up to helping folks at 80% of area median income and less. But by and large, most of these developments are still helping folks primarily at 60% of area median income and less. For a family of 4 in Los Angeles County, I've given you what those numbers are. 60% area median income for a family of 4 is about 71,000 and change. The 80% number is about 95,000 and change. Federal law also restricts the rents you can charge, and they administer that restriction by bedroom size. So there are restrictions for studios and 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms and so on. What I've shown you here is for LA County, the limit for a 60% AMI targeted 2-bedroom unit is $1,608 a month. If you're targeting it to folks at 80% of area median income and below, then it's $2,100 and change. Next slide. I wanted to just also alert you to the fact that these rents under which these units are regulated are not driven by the actual resident's income, but they are instead established, again, we use the term imputed, they're established by formula. And they're taking that, they're making assumptions at the federal level about a typical household size in a given number of given number of bedroom sized unit. And they're establishing it on that basis, not on the actual income of the household. So for example, I mentioned the 2-bedroom unit, 60% AMI targeting, $1,608 a month is the rent. And that is going to be roughly 30% of I think it's a 3 or 4 person household's income who's earning 60% AMI. But frequently that unit is going to be rented to somebody who's earning less than 60% of AMI. So 60% of area median income is the maximum income that the household can earn and qualify for that unit. But frequently it's a lower than that income earning household that ends up getting that unit. So for example, perhaps your household is earning 40% of AMI. You're going to get that unit that's targeted to folks at 60% and below, but you're going to end up paying 40% of your household income in rent. So that is certainly more affordable than the marketplace is charging for rents for a comparable unit. But under conventional understandings of affordability, where you really don't want, especially low-income households, paying more than 30% of their income in rents, frequently households in these properties are going to be paying more than 30% of their incomes for rent. Okay, next slide. Let me come back to basis for a second. We're talking about that calculation of how much credit might this property qualify for. Basis is a tax term. It's referring to those costs under federal tax law that are associated, those development costs that are directly associated with developing a physical asset that under federal tax law is going to devalue over time or is depreciable over time. So that includes virtually all of the costs in an affordable housing development, but one of the big costs that is excluded is the cost of land. So under federal tax law, land is not depreciable. Only improvements are viewed as devaluing over time under federal tax law. So land, the cost of acquiring the land is not includable in basis in the low-income housing tax credit program. There are also some legal costs and some construction period interest costs that are not includable in basis. But other than that, virtually all development costs associated with these affordable housing developments are includable in basis. So it's that basis number that's used in that calculation of credits. I want to mention real quickly too that that basis number before we do the calculation of credits can be increased or boosted if the project is located either in a qualified census tract or a small difficult development area. Again, these are federal terms, and these are embedded in the federal low-income housing tax credit program statute. So what they're trying to do at the federal level is reward developers for going into qualified census tracts. And you might think of those in the broadest terms as kind of poverty impacted census tracts. Or alternatively, they're going into a difficult development area, which is actually expressed by not census tract, but by zip code, just to make matters confusing. But if you're going into a zip code where it is more expensive to develop, then you're also going to get a boost to your basis number before we do the calculation of what kind of credits you're eligible for. That last bullet just is letting you know that the state of California has some latitude in designating additional difficult development areas, and they've done so for properties that are helping special needs populations and or are using state credits. That's not super critical for today's presentation, but just wanted you to know that. So let's go on to the next slide. And this kind of shows you an example of how this works. If it's a 9% tax credit deal, and let's assume it's 100 units and it's all in, it's coming in at about $550,000 a unit. So it's going to cost about $55 million all in to develop this project. And let's further assume that land and other legal and interest costs that are part of that 55 million get excluded from basis. And so down below, the 50 million in basis is kind of the assumption for this example, that we've excluded 5 million in land costs and other excluded costs. Let's further assume this property is in a QCT or a DDA, so it gets this boost, and that boost is a 30% boost to basis. So you multiply the 50 million by 130%, and that 50 million in basis becomes 65 million, which I thought merited an exclamation point because that actually exceeds the total cost of the development. But that's the number we're going to use in calculating the outside limit of what this property might qualify for. So the math here would be 9% times the 65 million. That's what you're seeing in that third box over from the left. 9% times 65 million is 5.85 million in annual federal credits. So that's what that property under federal rules could qualify for with the amount of basis and its location. And going for 9% credits, it could qualify for 5.85 million in credits annually. Now, I'm emphasizing annually because I mentioned earlier that they actually are going to, the partnership and ultimately that taxpayer, they're going to get that benefit in each of 10 years. So they're going to get 5.85 million off of their federal tax liability in year one. They're going to get another 5.85 million in federal tax liability removed in year two, and again 5.85 million in year three, all the way up through year 10. So the way developers and investors think about this really is that last box over on the right. This is really 58.5 million in federal low-income housing tax credit benefit over that 10-year period. And that's what they're putting out into the marketplace. Who would like $58.5 million in federal tax benefit over 10 years? And that's where you might get a bidder saying, I'll pay 58.5 million for that. So they're capitalizing that 10-year benefit and bringing that in to help defray the costs of the deal. Now, I should tell you, with that little asterisk down at the bottom, what I just described to you is the federal rule. Here in California, and frankly, most states have put a lower cap on how much can a given project really apply for. And the answer here in California at the moment is 2.5 million. So think 25 million over the 10-year period is really, as a practical matter, the largest amount of 9% credits an applicant could apply for. That could bring in 25 million to help defray those total development costs. Okay, now do we have questions?
There is one question. Will developments in opportunity zones qualify for a boosted basis?
Good question, and they do not. At the moment, it's just those qualified census tracts and difficult development areas. The one maybe caveat I would give you is that the state of California does have some discretion if they wanted to, with 9% credits only, to designate opportunity zones as a DDA. The state could do that if it chose to, but it hasn't, to my knowledge.
One other question is, what is the timing of TCAC application submittals and the timing of approval notification and the development timeline?
The first part of that was, what is the timing, like the application timing? Was that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So at the moment, I think this is still true. And again, other presenters jump in if I'm out of date here, but they typically have 2 rounds a year. And I'm trying to remember, I think applications are due in, Yasmin, yes?
March and July.
March and July. And then they make awards, what, in June and September or something like that?
Yeah, about 2 months later.
Yeah. So that's the typical cycle, 2 rounds. I should tell you, it's not uncommon, unless Yasmin tells me it is, that applicants will apply in the first round. It's very competitive. It's not unusual to be unsuccessful in the first round. Maybe you go back and you tweak your application a little bit to make it more successful, and you come right back in the second round. And so you compete not only with returning unsuccessful first round applicants, but also new second round applicants. Does that still happen?
Sure does.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so there's that dynamic. Let's see. And I mentioned the awards come a couple of months later, and then some paperwork gets executed to memorialize the reservation, and then that's what you take out to other lenders and potential investors. Okay, you know what? I know that I'm running way behind here, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start really just sort of flipping through these things. How about if we go to the next slide? All this is showing you, and you can review it at your leisure when you get a copy of this presentation. What does that look like for a 4% model? So I'm using tax-exempt bond financing with 4% credits. Same exercise, except you're going to end up with a smaller available reservation of credits at the federal level under federal rules. And again, the TCAC may have implemented limits below these federal caps as well, to my knowledge, but then again, maybe not. Okay, so there's that. Why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide? I'm going to circle back or stay with that 9% competition for a moment. I mentioned it's limited by federal formula, and that topmost bullet on the right shows you what that federal formula is. These days, this year, it's $2.60 per Californian. And so the California population at the time this formula was executed was about 39.2 million, times that $2.60 per person. And that $102 million figure represents, here's what is available statewide in California in the form of 9% credits. But again, remember, that's an annual federal credit figure. So you might think, okay, so that's 102 million in the aggregate that's going to be available eventually in year 1, and again in year 2, and in year 3, all the way out through year 10 for those developments that get these reservations and ultimate awards of credit. So again, that 102 million really is about what, 1.02 billion annually in federal credits that are available statewide. But the expression at the federal and here in California at that level is annual federal credits. So that's what you see in the balance of this slide. There are set-asides that are established by the state of California where they took that 102 million and began to put that 102 million into buckets. And you can see what those various buckets are. And unless there's a question on this, I'm probably just going to move on to the next slide. Any questions?
Question is, does 4% or 9% matter to developers in California since 2.5 million is the cap?
It does matter. And I don't know if either Yasmin or Laura want to take that. That is, what is the decision making when one is trying to decide, do I go 4% bond or do I go 9%?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, and Laura, feel free to jump in. Generally, what I'm looking at is for more expensive projects, I'm probably going to use bonds and credits because I might have so much basis that it doesn't really make sense for me to limit myself to the 2.5 million annual cap for the 9% program. the 4% program doesn't have that same cap. And so it gives you more flexibility if your project is more expensive or otherwise wouldn't be competitive for 9%. So I don't know, I guess from my point of view, I feel like maybe somewhat smaller projects are probably more appropriate for 9%. So I'd say maybe up to 75 units, I might be looking at 9%. Anything bigger than that, I'm probably, at the 9% version is probably not on the table.
What was
And
that
there
size
are other
cutoff?
things.
What was the
Sorry?
size cutoff? What was the size?
I mean, it's just roughly speaking, it's not, and I haven't really tested it very carefully, but I would say probably at around 75 units is probably where it doesn't make sense to make it a 9% project.
And I think that plays out in TCAC's annual reports that 4% deals in the aggregate are bigger and 9% deals tend to be smaller. Yeah. Laura, did you have anything to add? Or
I think Yasmin nailed it. I just add that sometimes we actually need to phase the really big projects and do them as 2 rounds of 4% in order to accommodate all the different sources that are needed.
2 rounds of 4%. Wow. Okay. Back in the day too, maybe this is getting too into the weeds, but I know 4% credits used to be used to re-syndicate deals. That is, deals that had been tax credit deals, but maybe they're 20 years old and they need another infusion of capital, used to come in for 4% credits. But I think that has kind of stopped. Yes.
Yeah, I guess it was last year. CIDLAC really revamped the rules around the scoring, for the program. And so at this point, I think you probably can't make a resyndication project competitive unless you put it into like the BIPOC category.
Okay.
Or to that BIPOC set aside. And for those of you who don't speak tax credit and bonds, the CIDLAC, the California Debt Limitation Allocation Committee, which allocates the state's bond cap, sort of when they revamped the scoring and the regulations last year, one of the things they did was to create a set aside for developers who are Black, Indigenous, people of color that have to meet certain criteria, and in terms of who leads the organization, who's on the board of directors, and that type of thing. And so because that set aside exists, I think there's maybe a little less competition there, and that a resyndication project could potentially be eligible, or, would have a fighting chance for an allocation in that category.
And thank you for reminding me too that it is somewhat recent. It is a recent dynamic that tax exempt bond financing became truly competitive. That is just a few years ago, I think. Again, in my day, it was undersubscribed, if you will. And it was never really exactly over the counter, but it was a pretty reliable bet that you could go in and get tax exempt bond authority and 4% credits pretty readily. But now it is competitive, and it's a different world. So again, I know I've run out of time. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to, and I think we're going to send this presentation out to folks. And so I just want to let you know on these next slides that they exist. So the 9% competition, further beyond those set asides I just showed you, divvies that bucket up geographically. And you can see how those geographies are administered by TCAC. So look at them at your leisure. There's both a percentage of the bucket that's available, as well as an actual dollar figure for this year, just for your information. If we could go to the next slide. This is just their scoring system. And again, I never intended to really go into each scoring factor, but just so you know, they look at the general partner or developer's experience, the management company's experience, and so on, including income targeting. I should tell you, as a practical matter, I believe this is still the case, that if you really want 9% credits, you've got to get all the points. You got to score full points, and it really comes down to tiebreakers. So going in, a developer is going to be thinking, I got to get all these points. Next slide. I mentioned the tiebreakers. Again, I'm not going to go into this really, but just so you know, there's kind of a first tiebreaker that at certain points in the process can be the decider. At other points in the process, it's not. All of which is to say, and again, especially, and I would echo both Yasmin and Laura's suggestion that get a consultant, because this is pretty hairy stuff, and consultants can help you navigate all this, and they will have thoughts about how might my project type fare in this competition, especially by virtue of that first tiebreaker. Is that going to hurt me or help me or what? But then it comes down, and maybe all of you have heard, or some of you have heard people refer to, oh, the final tiebreaker, and it's just such a source of the gnashing of teeth and anxiety. This is what it is. It's 2 ratios. And again, I'm not really going to go into this other than to let you know the topmost ratio there, soft resources over total development cost, total residential development cost, is really getting at TCAC wants you to go out and get as much soft debt as you can from either the State Department of Housing or local resources, be it the county or the city. Get soft resources in there. You want that first ratio to be as high a percentage as possible. So it's big. Can I go back to that slide just for a quick second? The second ratio is that one below the plus sign. And that is that parenthetical requested, unadjusted, eligible basis is really TCAC's attempt to get developers to step away from as much basis as possible before calculating the credits. In other words, TCAC wants to spread the credits out, and so they will reward you for requesting less credit. And you can do that by reducing the amount of basis that you would like TCAC to count when they do the calculation. So if you've figured out a way to step away from some credits, they will reward you for doing that. And again, that's over that same denominator, total residential development costs. The 2 numbers at each end, the 1 minus and the divided by 2, let me just leave you with this. The divided by 2 was an attempt to diminish the strength of this second ratio when you combine those ratios. It's trying to make that second ratio a little less important than that first one. Soft resources is the key. The 1 minus is simply a mathematical tool for, once you come up with that ratio, let's invert it by subtracting it from 1. And that way, when you've got one ratio that's trying to push you toward a high ratio and one that's trying to push you to a low ratio, if you combine them, they kind of nix each other. So we got to invert one and before we add them together, and just leave it at that. Whew. Here's some numbers if you want an example, and I'm not going to go into it, but there's the numbers, and we're using some of the figures from that earlier example of the 9% credit deal. I also wanted to leave you with this. This is for me, still a somewhat recent notion where TCAC is also going to reward a deal in the tiebreaker, the all-important final tiebreaker. They're going to boost that tiebreaker if your property is in what they refer to as a highest resource area or a high resource area. And you can go to their website and see, you can enter, I think, your property address, and it'll tell you what kind of resource area are you in. And I think there are 5 categories ranging from highest resource area to what in effect is lowest resource area. And it looks at things like, I think it looks at environmental issues, but also economic factors. I think public school performance factors. It factors in a variety of features, all of which is trying to get at, if we put an affordable housing development into a highest resource area, does that not afford more opportunities for the residents of that development? And the belief is that the answer is yes. And so let's try to get as many deals as we can, or at least spread our deals out among the various resource areas, but let's especially put some rewards into our system for getting into those high and highest resource areas. So know that when you're working with a developer, they're probably going to have one eye on where is this property in relation to that resource map. Tax exempt bonds, I'm not going to go into this. I think we already mentioned it's now competitive. They also have pools and set-asides. We can just keep flipping. And I apologize that I ran long here. They also have geographic regions, but they're different. And the one thing I wanted to highlight, I'm not sure if I do this on the next slide. Nope, let's go back to that prior slide. That inland region, which TCAC uses to mean the Inland Empire. So think Riverside and San Bernardino, and I think maybe even Imperial County. This inland region is not that, but it does include those counties I just mentioned, but it also includes, I want to say Kern County. I mean, it goes up the Central Valley. So be aware you're now going to be competing, if you're in the Inland Empire, in a region that's quite different than perhaps what you're used to in the tax, in the 9% tax credit program. Otherwise, you know, they've consolidated some areas. This is their scoring system. It has some overlap with the 9% system, but it is somewhat different. Again, a consultant can help you navigate all this. They too have a tiebreaker, and it's a little different than the 9%. It still is going to reward you for, you know, stepping away from bond allocation. So if you can find other resources to make them able to stretch their bond allocation throughout the state, they will reward you for doing that. They look at it a little differently. They factor in how many bedrooms in your units. And yeah, anyway, it's a little more involved and it's a little different, but they're kind of getting at some of the same stuff. I don't know, Yasmin and Laura, if you have a thumbnail on, here's how it's really different. No. Yeah. All right. I know those last several slides went through very quickly, and I apologize for that, but do folks have any questions?
There was just one last question. How are incentives for all electric affordable housing, new construction, considered or prioritized in capital funding and layered financing?
Yeah, again, I might punt here to our consultant and developer because I know things have changed a bit. We used to have in our scoring system points for energy efficiency and resource efficiency, but I'll pause there. And Laura, do you, or Yasmin?
I'll just add that. Oh,
Go ahead, Laura.
okay. We'll tag team it. I know that at least in the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, that is now, I'm not sure if it's a requirement or it becomes a de facto requirement in order to score enough points to win. I know that we had to do that last year on a project that we've got in the works. So
Laura, you're referring to another state-funded lending program, if you will.
I don't believe it's a TCAC requirement yet, but it is popping up in some of the other financing programs. Yasmin, do you want to add to that?
No, that's pretty much what I was going to say.
But do they still have a scoring category around resource efficiency in the tax credit system?
Sustainability.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. It can be LEED certified or Green Points rated, some other programs that.
And I presume all electric helps advance you in those systems, yes? LEED, et cetera. Yeah, okay.
I think I'll step in here. First of all, want to express my appreciation to the speakers, to Yasmin, to Laura and Bill. Clearly, there's enough information here for us to go on for a little bit longer, and hopefully, when we do our conference live in October, we'll be able to do this in a longer form, which will really allow for a deep dive and real interactive conversation. But I will just say, I think that you guys made the best of it in short form and via Zoom. So thank you to you guys for presenting, and thanks for everybody for joining. And then also want to express my appreciation for the partnership with CECITA, and that we were able to get together and not only provide this for folks who are within the SCAMP region, but in other parts of the state. So I think with that, if it's all right, I'm gonna declare this meeting concluded.
Yeah, I'd like to also just thank SCAMP on behalf of CECITA, as well as the presenters, and extend a thank you to our sponsors, Bank of California, and as well to all the attendees. Thank you all.
Thank you guys so much.